She was the girl no one noticed, until one man finally did. In the eyes of her neighbors, the mere fact that Grace helped keep the business running meant she wasn't fit for polite company. Every Sunday as she sat stiffly in the church pew, she could feel the weight of their glances heavy with disapproval. Still, Grace kept her head down and worked hard, refusing to let their narrow minds define her. But beneath her composed exterior, she was growing weary. The constant judgment, the stares, the half-heard remarks, over time they chipped away at her spirit. In a town where reputations were built or destroyed by whispers, Grace found herself trapped by the very values she had grown up believing in. To an outsider, she may have seemed like just another quiet shopkeeper's daughter. But behind her careful smile lived a woman aching for freedom, from assumptions, from control, and from a life that was never truly hers. As the snow thickened outside and the fire inside the trading post flickered weakly, Grace began to wonder if she'd ever be able to carve out a place for herself where she could simply be seen for who she was, not for where she worked or what others believed about her. The storm rolled in faster than Grace expected, sweeping across the prairie like a vengeful spirit. Snow thickened the air, blinding her as she tried to escape the judgment and whispers that clung to her like frost. Wrapped in a woolen cloak and boots barely suited for such bitter cold, she wandered into the whiteness, unsure of where she was heading, only knowing she had to get away. But the Midwest in winter is no place for a lone woman. The temperature dropped well below freezing, and soon her footsteps vanished behind her. When she fell through a thin sheet of ice hidden beneath the snow, her ankle twisted sharply, and with every painful step after hope slipped further away. Darkness crept in. The howling wind drowned out her sobs. Grace finally collapsed, her body giving up before her spirit did. Snow began to cover her like a shroud, and the world faded. Miles away in a log cabin, tucked among the trees, Caleb Mason heard something faint but distinct. A cry. At first he dismissed it as wind playing tricks, but it came again clearer this time. Grabbing his coat and lantern, he stepped into the blizzard. Every step was a fight against the cold and the deepening snow. Then he saw her, a figure half buried, lifeless and still. He knelt down, brushed away the snow from her face, and felt for a pulse. It was weak but there. He didn't think twice. Caleb hoisted her into his arms, her body limp, her breath faint against his neck. The weight was heavy, the journey back perilous, but he pushed forward, gritting his teeth against the wind. Back at the cabin, he laid her near the fire, wrapped her in wool blankets, and gently rubbed warmth back into her fingers. He whispered to her, urged her to hold on, to stay with him. All through the night he fed the fire and checked her breathing. By morning her eyes fluttered open. She was alive, and though he didn't know her name yet, Caleb felt something shift deep inside, a stir of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Maybe this woman had wandered into his life for a reason. When Grace finally awoke, the warmth startled her. A fire crackled in the hearth, its soft orange glow flickering against the log walls of a small cabin. The scent of pine smoke filled the room, mingling with the sharp tang of cold air that still clung to her skin. She shifted beneath the blankets, wincing as pain flared in her ankle. Then she saw him, a man broad-shouldered and weather-worn, sitting near the fire with a quiet, unreadable look in his eyes. He didn't smile, didn't offer false comfort, just nodded and said, "You're lucky I found you." Grace's heart pounded, not just from the pain, but from the realization of where she was. Alone, in a strange man's home. In a town like hers, that kind of circumstance could end a woman's future before it began. She was already judged for simply working near a bar. Now this, her breath caught, her cheeks flushed with panic as she tried to sit up. "I need to leave," she whispered, voice shaking. Caleb, unmoved, shook his head. "Not in this storm you don't," he said calmly. "You wouldn't make it a mile." The tone of his voice wasn't commanding, but firm. Not cruel, but clear. It wasn't permission he offered, it was protection. Grace looked toward the window where snow still piled up against the glass and felt her heart sink. She was trapped in more ways than one. Still, there was no judgment in Caleb's gaze. No expectations, no pity. Just quiet concern. He offered her a mug of something, hot tea maybe, and she took it, fingers trembling. The silence between them was thick with questions neither dared to ask. But somehow in that stillness, there was something else too. Safety. She whispered, "Thank you." He didn't reply, just stoked the fire again, and glanced out the window at the storm still raging. In a world where men often talked too much and said too little, Caleb's silence spoke volumes. In that small cabin far from wagging tongues and icy stares, Grace found her first moment of peace in months. And though she didn't know it yet, this moment would change everything. As the storm broke and the snow finally began to melt into thick, muddy slush, Caleb helped Grace make her way back to town. Her ankle, though tender, held steady with each step, and Caleb never strayed more than an arm's length away. The journey should have brought relief returning to familiar ground to her father's trading post, but as the rooftops came into view and the sound of townsfolk drifted on the wind, Grace's heart sank. This wasn't a homecoming, it was a reckoning. The moment they stepped onto Main Street, eyes turned. It wasn't the curious gaze of neighbors. It was suspicion judgment dressed as concern. Whispers stirred like dry leaves in the wind. She stayed with him alone. The implication was as loud as a church bell on Sunday morning. Grace could feel it in every sidelong glance, every subtle shake of a bonneted head. The values of their town were carved in stone, especially when it came to women, and she had unknowingly broken all the unspoken rules. Inside the trading post, her father stood behind the counter, his expression a mix of relief and restrained anger. The store went quiet the moment Grace walked in with Caleb. Her father didn't raise his voice, he didn't need to. His words came like a slow, heavy wind. "Do you have any idea what this has done?" he asked, his eyes never leaving hers. Grace tried to speak to explain, but he silenced her with a raised hand. "It doesn't matter," he said. "They've already decided." Beside her, Caleb said nothing. He didn't defend himself or make excuses. When her father turned to him and asked what kind of man would let this happen, Caleb answered with quiet strength, the kind who kept her alive. The tension in the room was thick, pressing down like low-hanging clouds. Then came the sentence, not from a judge, but from her own father. "The only way to fix this," he said, "is for you two to marry." The air drained from Grace's lungs. She hadn't asked for this. But in that moment, surrounded by judgment and obligation, she saw no way forward but the one being carved out for her. The wedding was no grand affair. There were no lace-covered pews or joyful bells ringing through town. Instead, Grace and Caleb stood in the drafty little church on the outskirts of town, beneath a sagging wooden cross, and the watchful eyes of townsfolk who came more to gossip than to bless. This is about a woman the world passed over until a quiet rancher, with pain on his hands and sorrow in his eyes, looked at her like she was the first spring flower after a brutal winter. If you've ever felt like Clara, living your life in quiet, just wishing someone would truly see you, then this story is for you. And if you think there are no second chances left for a woman past her prime step into the only love story where silence speaks the loudest. The train from Missouri rolled slowly into Dust Creek, Texas, groaning on the tracks like it too carried burdens that weren't its own. Dust devils danced along the edge of the station as passengers disembarked in silence, save for the clatter of trunks and the low murmur of ranch hands waiting on shipments of seed feed and horseshoes. And stepping down from that train, in a plain gray dress and a green shawl she had knitted herself, was a woman no one had been waiting for. They spent their mornings side by side, Caleb mending the fence with his sleeves rolled up. Grace bent over her patch of earth, where she had begun planting a humble vegetable garden. The soil was stubborn, like everything on the frontier, but she welcomed the effort. It was something she could shape, something that grew under her care. And beside her, without saying much, was Caleb, always watching, always helping when she struggled with a particularly stubborn root or heavy rock. Their conversations, once sparse and functional, had deepened into quiet exchanges about the past. Grace shared stories of her mother's hymns sung during the long hours in the trading post. Caleb, in return, spoke softly of the fire that took his family, how he had wandered into the wilderness to escape not just loss, but people. They didn't speak every feeling aloud, but they didn't need to. Their silences were no longer awkward. They were understood. Then one evening, as the sun stretched long over the clearing and the trees were lit in gold, Caleb handed Grace a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside was a wooden carving, rough, uneven, but tenderly shaped into the figures of a man and woman standing close together. "It's us," he said simply. Grace turned the carving over in her hands, the edges warm from where he'd held it. It wasn't perfect, but it didn't need to be. "Thank you," she whispered, and their eyes met. That night they sat by the fire, a stillness between them that wasn't empty but full. Full of everything they'd weathered and everything they'd quietly started to build. Without fanfare or promises, love had arrived not as a grand declaration, but as something carved slowly, steadily into the days they shared. "No worse," another replied. "Some say she's a witch, put a hex on Elias Boone himself." Elias heard it all. He carried the weight of their stares each time he rode into town for supplies. But he said nothing. He had never cared for the opinions of small-minded folk. Yet even a man as stoic as Elias knew that words could cut deeper than steel, and now those words had reached his ranch. It came on a Tuesday. The morning was crisp, the air smelling of wet earth after an early rain. Elias had risen with the sun tending to the horses when he spotted it, a rough plank nailed crooked to the side of his barn. The message was carved deep in block letters, painted a crude, angry red. "God don't bless what's stolen." He stared at it a long while. His jaw tightened. Without a word, he pried the board loose, carried it to the hearth, and burned it to ash. He didn't tell her. But when supper came that night, she must have known. Whether by instinct or by the weight in Elias's shoulders, something had shifted. Without a word, she reappeared at the dinner table, wearing the coarse burlap sack once more. Her scarred face was hidden again, her identity wrapped in rough cloth. The boys were confused. The youngest whimpered into his plate. The oldest clenched his fists in silent protest. Elias said nothing as he passed the bread, but inside a slow fury was building. Later, after the dishes were cleared, Elias sat alone on the porch, the old music box at his side. Its song wound through the night like a fragile thread of hope. He waited, and when the moon rose high, she came. Barefoot, her steps soft on the wooden boards. The sack was gone again, her face pale in the silver light. "They think you sinned," Elias said quietly. "I have," she whispered, her voice raw. "It don't matter," he replied. "This land's full of sinners. The only difference is who's been forgiven and who ain't." She looked toward the barn, her eyes shadowed. "I dug a grave," she said softly, "for a man who wasn't yet dead." Elias didn't press her. He only nodded, knowing that some stories were better carried in silence. That night the music box played slow and steady, but her hands, though trembling, never reached for the sack again. Yet even as the sack stayed folded, a darker storm was riding fast toward the ranch, one that no kindness or quiet resolve could outrun. The man she feared was coming, and next we'll meet him face to face. Don't miss what happens next. The days on the ranch passed with cautious peace, but the air held a tension like the sky before a summer storm. Each sunrise brought with it the silent question, when would he come? It was a warm afternoon when the quiet was broken. Elias was in the barn oiling the hinges on the old stall door when he heard the rhythmic pound of hooves. The sound was deliberate, not the casual trot of a passing traveler. Stepping into the sunlight, Elias saw him. A lean man in a red coat sat astride a black gelding, his face shadowed beneath a broad-brimmed hat. He was sharp-edged like a blade too long kept from a sheath. His smile wasn't one of greeting, but of ownership. "Name's Wyatt Fielding," the man called out, voice slick as oil. "Looking for someone." Elias didn't blink. "Ain't many folks here." "I heard a woman came this way." Fielding continued, dismounting with an easy grace that spoke of a man used to getting what he wanted. "Name don't matter. She left owing me something." Elias straightened, every muscle in his body tensed, not in fear, but in readiness. "You lost someone," he said coolly. "Go find them, but she don't belong to no one." Fielding's smile thinned. "That's so, that's so." Their gazes locked, the air between them crackling. Fielding's tone turned darker. "Sometimes folks forget where they belong. Sometimes they get turned around. I'm here to collect what's mine." Elias's voice dropped low. "She ain't yours. I'll be back," Fielding sneered, turning to mount his horse. "Folks around here will talk once the sun drops." And with that, he rode off, dust trailing behind. Elias stood for a long moment watching the horizon. Then he turned and strode back toward the house. She was already waiting in the doorway, face pale, eyes wide. "You saw him?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I did." Her shoulders sagged. "He'll lie. He always does." Elias nodded. "Then I won't listen." Tears welled in her eyes. "You don't even know what I've done." "I don't need to," he said firmly. I know what you've done here. She faltered as if his words had cracked something deep within her. The next morning she packed a small satchel. Elias found it by the door. You leaving? He asked softly. If I stay, they'll come. They already did. He met her gaze. Stay and I'll stand between. She hesitated. The satchel remained where it was. That evening, as she hung the wash under a bruised sky, Elias stood beside her lantern in hand. You hang it like it's sacred, he said. Maybe it is. In that moment, Elias knew she wasn't running anymore. And neither was he. But Wyatt Fielding wasn't a man to let go lightly. When he returned with the law at his side, what unfolded next would test every ounce of courage Elias and the woman had left. Stay tuned. The reckoning is near. The sun rose gold and clear the next morning, but Elias Boone knew the storm had not passed. Trouble always had a way of circling back, and now it rode on horseback beneath a badge and a lie. He stood at the fence rail, mug in hand, watching the far road. Behind him, she moved quietly on the porch, bare feet brushing the boards, tension coiled in her slender frame. The boys fed the hens nearby their laughter, unaware that the piece was counting its final moments. Just after midday, the dust appeared on the horizon. Two riders. Wyatt Fielding led the way, smug and upright, the red coat bright against the sun. Beside him rode Sheriff Luther Quaid, his face carved from stone beneath his worn Stetson. They dismounted in unison, boots stirring the dry earth. Elias didn't move. He waited, every muscle loose but ready. The sheriff spoke first. Boone, there's a claim laid against her. He pulled a folded paper from his coat. Man says she's his wife. Name's on record back in Elk Hollow. She ran out on me with my property, Fielding cut in, voice oily. Abandoned her duties, assaulted me, stole my boys. Elias glanced once toward the porch. She was there, standing behind the screen, the boys clutching her skirt. But this time she didn't wear the sack. She wore her face quiet, stripped of fear, as though she'd already lived this moment in her bones. She's got bruises that go deeper than ink, Elias said evenly. He's got papers, Quaid replied. She's got truth. Fielding stepped forward. She belongs with me. Elias took one step forward, voice steady. She belongs with no one, she stays. The air crackled, brittle as a bone ready to snap. Quaid sighed. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I'm not the one making it, Elias said. I gave her shelter and space. More than he ever did. Fielding's mouth twisted. You saying she's yours now? Elias turned and walked back up the porch steps. Tell them, he said softly. Her hands trembled, but she moved forward, the boys holding back as she taught them. She stepped down the steps, standing alone between the men who claimed her and the man who did not. I left him, she said, her voice ringing clear. He beat me, beat my sons, put rope marks on my wrists and told me I was less than a dog. I didn't run. I survived. Fielding laughed. You expect them to believe that she faced Quaid? I dug a grave once. For him, I couldn't do it. So I ran. Now I raise my children in quiet. I ask for nothing. Quaid studied her. He's got law on paper, but you've got truth in your face. Fielding's face darkened. His hand twitched toward his pistol, but Elias was faster. The shotgun gleamed in his grip, steady as stone. Don't, he said, voice low as thunder. Not here. Fielding hesitated, rage choking him. Make your next move, Count, Elias warned. You won't get another. After a long beat, Fielding spat and mounted his horse. This ain't over. It is if you ride west, Elias said coldly. As the sheriff and Fielding rode off, dust trailing behind them, the ranch fell silent. But it was a different silence now, not fragile. Final. She turned to Elias, her voice soft. You risked your name for me. He shook his head. You did that yourself. I just stood beside you. But even with the gunfire avoided for now, would the town ever accept her truth? And would the shadows truly let her go? The next chapter would reveal what mercy really costs. Stay tuned. The sun rose gentle the next morning, casting a soft gold across the ridge. The storm had passed, but its echoes lingered. Elias Boone stood behind the barn with a small wooden box in his hands. She stood beside him, her face calm, her gaze steady. The boys watched from a few paces back, uncertain but unafraid. Inside the box was no body, no thing of flesh. Just the sack. Folded, careful as a flag, rough and worn the last remnant of shame she had carried like a second skin. Without words, Elias knelt and began to dig. The earth turned dark beneath his hands. When the hole was ready, he lowered the box into it and covered it with soil. She placed a small stone atop the fresh earth. No words. Just the wind cool and clean, as if something old had finally been laid to rest. Later that morning, Elias did something he had not done in years, not since the day he carried his wife's coffin down the same dirt path. He rang the church bell. It echoed across Rattlesnake Crossing like a thunderclap, shaking dust from window panes and pulling folks from their routines. They came in knots and clusters, suspicious, drawn by habit and curiosity. The pews filled with familiar faces, Hetty Jane with her tight mouth, Sheriff Quaid with guarded eyes, Pastor Merrick standing pale behind the pulpit. But it was Elias who stepped forward first. He didn't shout, didn't sermon. He simply cleared his throat and spoke in a voice steady as oak. "There's a woman among you," he began, "who came here with nothing but shame, and 3 boys who hadn't laughed in weeks. You didn't ask her name, you didn't ask her story, but you judged her just the same." The room shifted, a wave of uneasy glances and dry coughs. "I bought her for $2, Elias continued. "But that ain't the truth of it. She wasn't for sale. She was thrown out like spoiled bread. All I did was catch her before the dogs could." He let the words settle, gaze sweeping across the crowd. "She cooked for me, mended my coat, fed my silence, and never once asked me to save her." A deeper hush fell. "I ain't asking you to bless it," Elias said. "I'm asking you to leave it alone." For a moment, no one spoke. Then Pastor Merrick stepped forward, voice soft but clear. "You're not the first to take in the forsaken, Elias. You won't be the last. Let the Lord sort the rest." No one argued. Later that day at the ranch table, food was laid out with care. The woman, their mother now in every way that mattered, sat at the head. Elias passed her the bread. She passed it to her boys. They ate in a warm, simple peace. Seasons turned softly over Rattlesnake Crossing. The bitter winds of gossip, once sharp as prairie thorns, began to lose their sting, not from sudden kindness, but from lack of fuel. Folks grew tired of wagging their tongues when there was no more scandal to feed on. At the North Ranch, life settled into a new rhythm, quiet, steady as a rocking chair on a summer porch. She walked with her head higher now. The boys, once shadows clinging to her skirts, grew straight and strong beneath the wide Montana sky. The oldest took to fencing with a sure hand and patient eye. The middle boy discovered a knack for cooking, soon turning simple biscuits into flaky delights Elias couldn't help but praise. And the youngest, once so full of tears, slept sound and deep, now tangled in blankets without fear. At sunrise, Elias often found her in the garden bed he had built for her that spring. She had planted sage and wild onions first, then added rows of bean squash and tomatoes. He'd watch from the fence rail, mug in hand, as she knelt among the green shoots, hands in the earth, as though healing something deeper than soil. When he offered to build her a bench by the barn, she stitched cushions for it herself, soft faded blue cloth with sturdy seams. Each evening after supper was cleared and the boys had tumbled off to their room, she and Elias sat side by side on that bench, watching the sun slip behind the ridge. Words were few but not needed. Sometimes a glance, a half smile spoke more than a page of letters. Minnie Hook, and in these quiet moments beneath the endless sky, they both wondered, could a life once shattered truly become whole again? In town, whispers gave way to nods of greeting. Hetty Jane still sniffed, but even she no longer spoke ill aloud. The sheriff tipped his hat when passing. Pastor Merrick included them in his prayers, subtle but sincere. The boys called Elias Pa now. Not with fanfare or permission, sought just one day in the middle of mending a fence post, the youngest had called out, "Pa, hand me that nail." Elias had paused, throat thick, but passed it without a word. The name stuck. As for marriage, no vows were spoken in the church. There was no need. The bond between them was built of deeds, not words, of mornings, shared storms, weathered side by side, and trust earned grain by grain. In time, her name, once whispered behind hands, was spoken with respect. Children ran past her garden laughing. Neighbors stopped to share a word. And when Elias looked at her beneath the cottonwood trees, he no longer saw the woman from the platform with a sack over her face. He saw the woman who stayed, who chose courage over fear, grace over bitterness. The wind across the ridge sang softer now, and in the stillness of twilight it seemed to hum this truth. Sometimes the wildest thing a soul can do is stay. The morning dawned clear and golden over the ridge, but Elias Boone knew in his bones trouble was riding. He stood at the fence rail, hot coffee in hand, watching the far line of the horizon. Behind him she moved barefoot across the porch, silent as always, but the tension in her shoulders told him she felt it too. The boys were down by the chicken coop laughing low, unaware that peace was counting its final moments. Just past noon, dust spiraled along the trail. Wyatt Fielding rode in sharp as a knife in his red coat, and this time Sheriff Luther Quaid rode beside him, face hard beneath his hat brim. They dismounted, slow boots stirring the dust like vipers in the sun. Elias didn't move, just waited. The sheriff spoke first. "Boone, we've got a claim. Man says she's his wife. Got papers from Elk Hollow." "Papers don't show bruises," Elias replied, voice steady. Fielding stepped forward, voice oily. "She's mine. Took vows, took my name, took my sons and ran." From behind the porch screen, she stood watching, no sack this time. Just her face pale but proud, as though she'd already lived this moment in her bones. "She don't belong to you," Elias said flat. "She stays." The silence was brittle as glass. Sheriff Quaid sighed. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be." "I didn't make it," Elias replied. "I gave her shelter. Something you never did." Fielding's lip curled. "You saying she's yours now?" Without words, Elias turned and opened the porch door. She stood still. He spoke soft but firm. "Tell them." Her hands trembled, but her voice rose clear enough to carry. "I left him. He beat me. Beat my boys. I survived." Her gaze met the sheriff's. "He'll lie. He always does." The crowd of silence cracked. Fielding laughed bitterly. "You expect him to believe that?" Quaid's jaw tightened. "I see 3 boys who don't flinch round Boone. I see a woman who don't cower no more." Fielding's pride snapped. His hand shot for his pistol. Fast, too fast. But Elias was faster. From behind the porch post came the cold gleam of his shotgun. Leveled, smooth and steady voice, low as gravel. "Don't," he said. "Not here." The world seemed to hold its breath. "Make your next move count," Elias added. "You won't get another." Fielding hesitated, sweat slick on his brow. The sheriff's hand hovered near his own holster, but stayed. "You gonna let him threaten me?" Fielding barked. "I'm gonna let you leave," Quaid replied. "That's mercy, not threat." Snarling, Fielding mounted. "This ain't over. It is Elias called Shotgun Firm. If you ride west." Dust rose behind the horses' hooves. Silence fell on the ranch, but it was a different silence now. One with no fear in it. She turned to Elias, voice shaking. "You risked your name for me." He shook his head. "You did that yourself. I just stood beside you." The following Sunday, under a sky scrubbed clean by the last of spring storms, Elias Boone did something he had not done in years. He rang the church bell. Its clear tones echoed across Rattlesnake Crossing like a call to judgment, or perhaps a call to grace. The townsfolk came in knots and clusters, curiosity and caution braided together. They shuffled into the small wooden church, their Sunday best wrinkled from restless hands. Pastor Merrick stood at the pulpit, but he didn't speak first. Elias did. He stepped forward, clearing his throat. "There's a woman among you," he began, voice rough with truth, "who came here with nothing but shame, and 3 boys who hadn't laughed in weeks." He let the words settle. "You didn't ask her name, you didn't ask her story, but you judged her just the same." Uneasy shifting followed, boots scuffing, the floor dresses rustling. "I bought her for $2, Elias continued. "But that ain't the truth of it. She wasn't for sale. She was thrown out like spoiled bread, and all I did was catch her before the dogs could." He paused, scanning the room, faces that had whispered, eyes that had avoided. "She cooked for me, mended my coat, fed my silence, and never once asked me to save her." His gaze sharpened. "I ain't asking you to bless it. I'm asking you to leave it alone." Pastor Merrick stepped up then, voice soft but firm. "You're not the first to take in the forsaken Elias. You won't be the last. Let the Lord sort the rest." No one argued. Not aloud. That afternoon something shifted in Rattlesnake Crossing. Whispers dulled. The church gathering gave way to a meal at the Boone Ranch. For the first time, the long table bore food like it remembered how. The boys laughed freely now. The woman sat at the head. Elias passed her the bread. She passed it to her sons. Hands moved gently. No words needed. As weeks turned to months, the town's gossip dried up, not from newfound kindness, but from lack of fuel. She held her head higher. The boys grew strong. The eldest took to fencing. The middle boy found joy in cooking. The youngest no longer cried in his sleep. Elias built her a new garden bed come spring. She planted sage and wild onions. He built a bench by the barn. She stitched cushions for it. And each evening they sat side by side on the porch watching the sun fold itself into dusk. Some still called her a mystery, others a scandal. But to Elias, she was simply someone who stayed when she could have run, someone who didn't ask to be saved, only seen. They never married, not in the church. But the boys called him Pa, and the townsfolk stopped asking when she'd leave. Because she didn't. She had come with shame upon her face. Now her name was whispered soft among the cottonwood trees. And Elias, he stopped measuring grief by what was lost and started measuring grace by what chose to remain. You still mine by contract. No, Mabel said, standing tall. Her voice wasn't loud. It didn't need to be. I was never yours. I may have come by letter, but I am no one's property. Samuel stepped closer, but Elijah moved between them, calm but unyielding. Clara nodded. Sarah hesitated, then looked up with tearful eyes. I was forced to marry, too. I didn't leave because I was afraid they'd call me shameful. But reading your words, I didn't feel so alone anymore. Clara took her hand. She didn't say anything. She didn't have to. In that moment, she understood her quiet words written in the dark had reached a soul that longed to be heard. The following Sunday, Eli led Clara up the hill behind the ranch to the place where he'd sat alone for so many years. The old oak still stood tall, bearing witness to the solitude he once knew. That day, he laid a cloth over the grass and gently pulled Clara down beside him. In his hand was a small wooden box. He opened it. No ring, no gold, just a silver necklace. And at its center, a pendant shaped like a tiny earplug carved from white quartz. He wrote in her palm, I cannot hear you with my ears, but I will always wear you next to my heart. Clara didn't cry. This moment wasn't for tears, it was for gratitude, for rebirth. They didn't hold a grand wedding. Just a quiet gathering. A few neighbors, a handful of orphan children Clara had once taught to read, and a harmonica song played by a blind boy from the orphanage. No loud vows. Just Clara placing her hand over Eli's heart, and Eli placing his hand over hers. Silence, but forever. After the wedding, they opened a place called the Quiet Hearth. A small refuge where women who had been cast aside, labeled unfit or not enough, could come live, learn, write, and rediscover their worth. No one was required to speak. Presence was enough. Clara had once been called too quiet. Eli had been labeled too silent. But between them there was never a lack of sound, because true love doesn't need to be loud. It only needs someone brave enough to stay to listen and to believe that even in silence, a heart is always calling home. She was once rejected for saying too little. He was forgotten by the world for hearing nothing at all. Yet in that very silence they found what the loudest voices never could: unconditional understanding, a love that asked for nothing, and a home where quiet was cherished like a sacred song. In the years that followed, the Quiet Hearth was never a refuge nor a convent. It was a place where no one had to explain why they came. They only needed to show up and live. Clara was no longer the woman who once bowed her head in the freezing rail car. Now she was the midwife for single mothers turned away by the town, the one who taught mute girls how to sign, the woman who helped widows write petitions to reclaim land taken from them by heartless laws. Eli remained as quiet as he'd always been. He cared for the horses, taught boys how to mend fences, even built simple mechanical tools to help the women around the homestead work more easily. He didn't need applause. Clara's nod was all the affirmation he ever wanted. One winter's day, someone knocked at the Quiet Hearth. A girl of maybe 17 stood there, hair tangled, dress torn, holding a newborn wrapped in a frayed blanket. A fresh bruise marked her neck. Clara opened the door. She didn't ask a single question. She just smiled. The girl broke down not out of pain, but because she knew she had come to the right place. Later, Clara wrote in her journal, "People think love is something you have to fight for, something you have to win. But I've learned that true love is quieter than that. It's simply someone who's still there when you can't speak yet, someone brave enough to stay through the silence." On the 5th anniversary of the day Clara first stepped foot in Dust Creek, she and Eli stood beneath the old oak tree, the place where he had once given her the quartz necklace. This time Clara carried a small wooden box. She handed it to him. Inside was a letter written in Braille. No one knew how long she had spent teaching herself to etch it by hand, night after night in silence. The letter read, "Ray, if one day I'm no longer beside you, read these words not with your eyes but with your hands. Because our love never needed ears. It never needed speech. It lives in every heartbeat and in the quiet places no one else had the patience to understand.